Your word is a light into our souls. Quiet our minds and open our hearts that we might receive the truth you have prepared for us this day and thus be made anew. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Our lesson today is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 31. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Isaiah 40:31 was the very first anthem text I set to music for the Covenant Choir when I started worshiping here as a graduate composition student. Balancing as many as 7 different jobs to finance my doctoral studies, while simultaneously devoting the necessary time to both academic and creative work, was physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausting. The promise of renewed strength and the image of soaring with eagles was regenerative and comforting to me. In the years that have followed, however, I have come to appreciate even more the opening lines of this text, the meaning of which I had brushed over in my earlier school years. They that wait upon the Lord. Aimed at the Israelites in captivity who had endured a long time of persecution, this text promised God's eventual comfort and renewal. But first, they had to wait, to hold on, to trust. Like many, my life has had times of intense wilderness wandering, times where I have felt lost or persecuted, times when God seemed distant. The most recent occurred about a decade ago, when difficult changes and challenges at both of my teaching institutions at the same time, coupled with changes within the church and the loss of my ministry to the children, left me feeling diminished and vulnerable. The loss of my composition mentor and the near loss of my mother that year deepened my sense of isolation. My sense of self was shattered, and it was a long, slow climb out of that particular wilderness. Faced with the choice offered by Job's friends to curse God and walk away, I chose instead to cling tenaciously to the promise of God's love and to wait. It was a long and gradual journey back, but God gently led me to a renewed, deeper sense of self, ready to mount up once more on the wings of eagles.
One of the formative experiences of writer Ernest Hemingway's life was getting injured while he was working as an ambulance driver during the First World War. Doctors pulled 237 pieces of shrapnel from his body, and he spent 6 months recovering in a field hospital. During that time, like all good writers, he became a keen observer of what was happening around him. And he was fascinated by the different ways that the various patients waited while their battle wounds healed, as they endured periods of recovery that at times seemed endless. Some distracted themselves with whatever they could. Some cried out almost continuously in lament, and others quietly pondered what their situation would mean for their lives and their futures. Tom Long observes that this experience seems to have lodged itself into Hemingway's psyche, For when he began writing his novels, the plot lines often centered around someone who was waiting to fight in a war, waiting for a bull to charge, waiting to be rescued at sea. There is no denying that waiting is part of the human experience. From the trivial, waiting for a stoplight to turn green or waiting in line at a store, to the profound, waiting to be rescued, waiting for healing, waiting to find love, waiting to die. It should be no surprise to us then that the Bible is full of stories of people who are waiting. Think of Abraham and Sarah, waiting to have that promised child. Think of the Israelites waiting to be freed from slavery in Egypt and then wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, waiting to enter the promised land. Think of David waiting for his turn to be Israel's king as he had been anointed to be at a very young age. Think of God's people oppressed and marginalized, waiting for the promised Messiah, the disciples waiting to figure out who this Jesus was and whether following him had really been a good idea. Think of the early church, waiting for the coming of Christ's kingdom, for which we wait still. What Hemingway learned about waiting is what we see in all of these biblical stories and in our own lives. Waiting does not break us or shape us. Waiting reveals us. How we respond to our unique experiences of waiting reveals something about who we are. Scholars typically divide the book of Isaiah into 3 distinct parts. Chapter 40, from which today's verse came, begins the second part of this book, and in this 15-chapter section, Isaiah offers words of comfort to the Israelites taken into exile by the Babylonians. This portion of Isaiah is addressed to people who are strangers in a strange land, refugees living far from home, held captive by a hostile regime that destroyed and occupied their land. This was a people who had begun to question God's promises, to wonder if God really cared about them, to ask whether God was even there at all. A people who were waiting. Now, some of the passages in this second section of Isaiah are the most beloved and most often quoted passages of the Bible. We often hear them during Advent, which is a season of waiting built into our liturgical year. We hear these passages as we prepare for Christmas because they speak of God's promised salvation, God's promised Messiah, and because they offer profound and poetic words of comfort to people who are waiting for God to be revealed. Clearly, Isaiah knows something about waiting. He knows that waiting, especially in a period of uncertainty and suffering, erodes hope, even as it fuels doubt. But Isaiah also seems to understand that waiting can be fertile ground for spiritual growth, because often it opens us up enough to learn a few things. Michael Scott Moore is a journalist who traveled to Somalia to research and write a book on the history of piracy in the Horn of Africa. Unfortunately, he hadn't been there very long when he himself was kidnapped by a band of armed pirates who held him captive for 2 years and 8 months. In the book he wrote about the experience, The Desert and the Sea, he writes, "Hope is like heroin to a hostage, and it can be just as destructive." When asked about this line in a recent interview, he elaborated, "Hope was a cycle," he said, "and after a while it became a destructive cycle. People say, 'How did you hang on to hope for 2 years and 8 months?' And the fact is, I didn't. I learned to live without hope. Having your hopes raised and then dashed every 2 weeks, which is what the guards tried to do to me, was devastating. It was actually no way to live. So I had to find a different level of existing, and it turns out you can live without hope. Because hope and despair are just two ways of approaching an uncertain future. If you simply don't think forward into the future, don't insist on a rosy outlook for the next couple of weeks or months or years, you can live in the moment. That's what I had to learn to do. I would have snapped if I had done it any other way. Moore learned that when hope is only directed to the future, it can actually be harmful, especially if those hopes get dashed over and over again. His experience of waiting taught him the importance of living in the present moment. It also taught him the importance of human relationships. When asked if he could identify anything positive about his years of captivity, he said it was the time he spent at sea on a ship with other hostages, because those other people in a similar situation became his friends. With other people around, he wasn't just focused on his own misery, he was able to be focused on the present and take comfort in human relationships. Notice that Isaiah does not address an individual. He is addressing all of God's people collectively. He calls us in seasons of waiting or seasons of suffering to help each other remember and cling to God's promises, which are not just for the future, but which are manifest in every moment, with every breath we take. In the verse Jenny picked from Isaiah 40, Isaiah reminds the exiles that they can take comfort in one another. He does this by identifying 3 different groups of people who will be strengthened by God. There are those who will mount up with wings like eagles. In other words, the strongest among them who will be able to do extraordinary things. But he also identifies those who will run and not grow weary, those who can continue to progress on their journeys. Finally, there are those who will be able to walk and not faint. This sounds like people who can barely put one foot in front of the other, but who nevertheless keep moving forward. What Isaiah describes in this one verse is a diverse community of people who move forward by the grace of God at different speeds, with different capabilities, but who move forward together. What is revealed throughout the Bible and throughout our own lives is that waiting, especially waiting for the promises of God, which so often seem distant and uncertain, is made more bearable when we wait in community. After all, this is exactly what the first churches were about. They sure never thought we'd be here 2,000 years from now. They came together to wait for God's coming kingdom, which they thought would be here any day. Before the verse that Jenny chose, Isaiah takes time to remind the people of God's power and presence in the world and in our lives. Have you not known, Isaiah writes, have you not heard? It is God who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. God who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in. God who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Isaiah knows one of the ways we can be present to God moment to moment, especially during a difficult season of waiting, is to look around and notice the beauty and majesty of the world God created. This lesson is articulated in Wendell Berry's poem, The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound, I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. In every moment, we are free to rest in the grace of God's extraordinary world, with the stars and the planets, the seas and the mountains, the plants and the animals who do not worry about tomorrow. All around us, within these walls and beyond them, people are waiting. People are waiting and wondering, will God ever show up to fulfill God's promises? Does God even care that we are suffering? Does God see that we are floundering? People within and beyond these walls wonder whether God will heal the pain and division in our church and in our country. People in the surrounding medical centers are desperate for healing or even for a peaceful end for themselves or for a loved one. People across our city, mourning lives lost to gang and gun violence, are hoping against hope for peace to be restored. People across our border are longing to be reunited with their children. All around us, within and beyond these walls, people are waiting. We are waiting. And while we wait, even when waiting erodes hope and fuels doubt, may today's words from Isaiah pierce our spiritual amnesia. May they remind us that in the midst of our waiting and our longing and our doubt, God is revealed to us in each and every moment, in the wonder and majesty of God's creation, and in the relationships we have with one another, relationships that comfort us and strengthen us beyond imagining, while we wait for God to come and make all things new. Amen.